we take you back to Cape Town now, where SABC News reporter Abra Barbier is joining us live outside the Cape Town City Hall as she continues to hear expectations for Finance Minister Enoch Godongwani's medium-term budget policy statement. Abra, who have you got with you now?
Now, lady, I have politicians back to back. I wish they would always be so eager to answer their phones and talk to me. No, I'm joking. I have with me Steve Swart of the ACDP, who always answers his phone. Mr. Swart, from what I heard yesterday, what you were saying in the message that you sent me, you also are concerned about the prospects that's very, very bleak this year. And I also asked you earlier on, what is different to what happened to last year? Is there any more room for growth? Is there any room for us to be excited?
Well, what happened last year was that there was 100 billion rand extra collected through commodity exports. Now that we don't have this year due to challenges both with Eskom load shedding and mainly with Transnet logistics. So what we are expecting is a tax deficit increased above what was forecast in February of about 50 billion rand. And that is significant because that money needs to be found somewhere. In addition to that, there are additional items that have to be budgeted for from an expenditure perspective, which is also deeply concerning. First of all, the public sector wage bill came in much higher than forecast. It was forecast at 1.6%, came in at 7.5%, and that means an extra 35 billion rand that must be found. And of course, the social relief of distress grant, which was going to come to an end at March, we're expecting that to be continued with, and that extra funding has to be found. So where does one find this extra funding? And this obviously is a concern to us because the budget deficit, if you leave it as it is, then you've got to borrow more money to pay that. And the rent costs obviously then crowd out expenditure on fighting crime, on hospitals and education. What we also say from the ACDP side is two things. There's a tax gap. There's about 300 billion rand tax that is owed that isn't collected. If 10% of that is collected, that's an extra 30 billion rand. Secondly, we've always said the tens of billions of rands that were stolen through state capture and corruption can be collected, and that can go towards balancing the books. But we are expecting an increased budget deficit today. We are expecting increased borrowings, and that places more pressure on the fiscus and of course on all of us that have to then service that increased budget deficit and government debt levels.
Mr. Swart, thank you so much for your time. I am going to now be crossing to Mr. Voted Vessels of the FF Plus. Thank you so much for joining us. You also answer your phone when I call you. Mr. Vessels, I asked you earlier on we were speaking about corruption in general. Just tell me at the top of how concerned are you about the money we lose to corruption each year?
We lose a lot of money to corruption and wrong priorities, obviously, wrong spending, being exploited. It's not always just clear-cut corruption. It's the policy framework allowing state-owned entities and government departments paying a lot more for goods and services that can be procured for much less in the private sector. And that's one of the biggest problems. You know, we hear about cost-cutting measures since 2012 in most medium-term budgets, especially when there's lower than expected collection of revenue, as we now have. And nothing comes from it. To cut on infrastructure expenditure will be bad because that does not stimulate economic development. To cut on service delivery is unacceptable. But where there should be cuts is unnecessary expenditure, such as overseas trips by ministers. Why was the president at the Springboks game? It's good for social cohesion, but people need jobs, people need food, people need houses, more than they need a president in France. We need to cut on VIP protection of ministers. We need to cut on catering. There, billions of rands can be saved and can rather be spent on infrastructure development that will stimulate economic growth.
Bloated cabinet?
It's a bloated cabinet, it's a bloated public sector, and that's why we also have the public wage bill crisis. That we expect the minister is this afternoon just going to repeat the same things he always says. Trade-offs, trying to accommodate the unions, but we have a huge problem with regards to an unsustainable public wage bill.
Thank you so much for your time. That was Voted Vessels of the FF Plus. I am now going to be speaking to Mr. Brett Hedden of the Good Party. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I know that you are always very passionate about the man on the ground. I mean, whenever I speak to you, that's always what comes out first. I just want to ask you about your concerns around the cutting across departments and the impact this might have on service delivery, which already is not that fabulous. Are you concerned about that?
I am concerned around the narrative that that the government has to make a choice between austerity measures, as they call them, and borrowing. And austerity measures often means cutting critical expenditure in the social services space, education, health and social security. And we would urge the government, and we hope not to hear that today, to if the choice is between borrowing and supporting critical social services like health, like education, and social security being grants to poor and low income families, then we must make the choice to borrow and not to cut.
And then what would that mean, more borrowing? What do you think that, what would that mean going forward?
The thing about borrowing is that South Africa's current debt to GDP ratio is not out of the norm for an emerging market country. So we have more space, we do have space to borrow more money, and then we would still be within the realm of emerging market peer countries. The thing about borrowing is that we must use the money for the right purposes. If it is wasted, if it is stolen, then that is when it becomes a burden and not a economic stimulus. So we must continue to, we must address the economic stagnation, and austerity measures have been shown around the world to entrench a stagnation and low growth and unemployment rather than to relieve it. And so to cut critical expenditure in social services and to infrastructure projects would be a huge mistake, and we should rather borrow to make up any revenue shortfall.
Thank you so much for your time. We'll speak to you after the speech.
Thank you.
That was Brett Hedden of the Good Party. Of course, we heard all three MPs speaking to us about their concerns in terms of, rising debt, borrowing, and what kind of services we can expect to be delivered to the people of South Africa should there be cuts across government departments. Another concern is the money wasted due to corruption. So hopefully we're going to be hearing more about that. I know that there have been calls for the NPA to be better resourced with a bigger cash injection. We don't know what's going to be happening along those lines, but that is what many of the parties have been saying, that we need more spending in terms of corruption and crime fighting and our justice entities in the country.